Hi, in this lesson we'll introduce variables. As you've experienced now, it's very easy to make calculations with Python. This is one of our first calculations from the plain example. The problem is there is a lot going on in that print function, and I can't totally remember what each number means. In programming, just like in math, we don't just use numbers in our calculations. We use variables. They will help make our programs more efficient and much easier to read. So let's talk about variables first. A variable is like a box with a name that holds a value to be used throughout a program. Let's take this box here and name it velocity. Now let's store the value of 150 inside of it. We can print the value of the variable by using its name in the print statement. To create the variable in Python, we have what we call an assignment statement. There are two parts to this statement: the name of the variable, velocity, and the value we are assigning to it, 150. Again, when I run this program, the print statement prints the value of the variable, not the name. Since we are storing a whole number, the type of variable is called an integer variable. As a reminder, an integer is any positive or negative whole number that doesn't have a decimal. If it did have a decimal, then we'd call it a float variable. A float number is really just an integer with a decimal point. The last thing we need to talk about is how to name a variable. There are a few simple guidelines to follow here. It must be descriptive, meaning the name must describe what the variable is representing. Variable means nothing, whereas width is telling us what it is storing. It can't start with a number, and most often should start with a lowercase letter. Instead of one length, change it to length underscore 1. All letters should be lowercase. And use underscores to separate words instead of spaces. Okay, now let's take our last example and incorporate our variables. First, let's assign our angle to variable. Then we use that variable to simplify our print function. Already that is much easier to read. Next, let's take 150, which is the plane's velocity, and assign it to a variable, and use the variable in the print function. And finally, let's actually assign the entire calculation in the print function to a variable. In this case, we are calculating the vertical component of the velocity, so we create a variable with that name. I called vel underscore y for short. I added the round function to round the calculation to the nearest integer. When we do this, we then can remove the calculation from the print function and just print vel underscore y. As you can see, this program is now broken down into logical steps and is so much easier to understand. We import numpy, create a variable for angle and velocity, then calculate the y component of the velocity, printing out the result. Awesome! Now it's your turn to introduce variables in your programs.